Good afternoon and welcome to ThinkTech Asia. It's Tuesday, January 13th, 2015. I'm your host, Keith Bettinger. A little later on in today's program, we'll be welcoming our guest, Dr. Jon Matsuoka, President and CEO of the Consuelo Foundation. Dr. Matsuoka will be talking to us today a little bit about the impact of Super Typhoon Haiyan, which struck the Visayan regions in the Philippines in late 2013. The Consuelo Foundation has been very active in the ongoing recovery effort, and Dr. Matsuoka will tell us a little bit about the status of the long process of rebuilding from the storm. Before we begin our discussion, though, we'll have our short news summary of ongoing issues in and around Asia. If you have any Asia-related events, this is just a reminder about our community calendar here at ThinkTech Asia. If you have any events to publicize, please contact me at ThinkTech@gmail.com. You can also send me questions and comments directly via my Twitter at KCCGeography. So now for our news summary. In South Asia, in Pakistan, the fallout continues after a tragic attack on the public school of Peshawar killed 150, most of them children, on December 16th of last year. Yesterday, the government of Pakistan executed 7 prisoners by hanging as part of a crackdown on militarism, and presumably to send a message both domestically and internationally, as U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry is currently visiting Pakistan for talks on economic aid, bilateral cooperation, and counterterrorism. After the school shooting, Pakistan lifted a 6-year moratorium on executions. The most recent executions brought to 16 the number of prisoners that have been executed in the past month. Some of those executed had been convicted of conspiring to assassinate former Pakistani President Pervez Musharraf, whereas another was convicted as part of the 2003 attack on the U.S. consulate in Karachi. Human rights groups criticize the executions as motivated by revenge and say that they will do little to address the root causes of domestic terrorism within Pakistan. Officials have said that Pakistan plans to execute around 500 militants in coming weeks. The government has taken other measures as well, including passing a constitutional amendment empowering military courts to try suspected militants, closing printing presses, and arresting guilty people allegedly guilty of hate speech, and in one province, going so far as allowing all employees of educational institutions, including teachers, to carry licensed firearms on campus. In South and Southeast Asia, Pope Francis this week embarked on his second papal visit to Asia in less than 6 months. During the trip, the pontiff is visiting Sri Lanka and the Philippines. Pope watchers say the trip indicates that Francis has embraced the region as a new priority in a broader effort to globalize the church and to play a greater political role in resolving conflicts in Asia. In Sri Lanka, the Pope will work to effect reconciliation between the factions in the long Sri Lankan civil war. Sri Lanka last week elected Maithripala Sirisena as president. The new president is said to have a liberal and democratic agenda, which will be a major change after a decade of increasingly authoritarian rule. The Pope will canonize Joseph Vaz, Sri Lanka's first saint. The Pope will then travel to the Philippines to celebrate Mass with survivors of Super Typhoon Haiyan, which we'll be discussing later. It is expected that the Pope will discuss environmental issues. Although the Pope will not make it to East Asia on this trip, he has declared his interest in getting involved in the Korean Peninsula, stating that I express my hope for a resumption of dialogue between the two Koreas, sister countries which speak the same language. Now, on to China and East Asia. Police in China's Xinjiang province in the northwestern part of the country have shot and killed 6 people allegedly attempting to detonate a bomb in the city of Shulei. This is the latest in a string of incidents in the province. In recent months, tensions flare between Han Chinese residents and the minority Muslim Uyghur population. Hundreds have been arrested and several executed as the government security crackdown, which began in May of last year in response to a market bombing at Urumqi, which killed 31 people. The government says unrest in the province has been masterminded by Uyghur separatists who are receiving support from abroad. On the other hand, activists blame the increase in incidents on China's repressive and discriminatory policies towards Uyghurs. Uyghurs, who are ethnically Turkic and Muslim, make up approximately 45% of the province's population, with an additional 40% being Han Chinese. The People's Republic of China established permanent control over Xinjiang in 1949, and since that time, there's been large-scale immigration of the Han Chinese to the province. In a related story, the Chinese government banned women from wearing the burqa in Xinjiang, Xinjiang's capital, Urumqi. Xinhua, China's official news agency, asserted that the burqa is not traditional dress for Uyghur women, but cited burqa bannings in Belgium and France as precedents for the action. Now, onto our interview segment. In November of 2013, Super Typhoon Haiyan, known in the Philippines as Yolanda, came aground in the Visayan Islands region of the Philippines. The storm, which devastated the city of Tacloban and surrounding areas, was the deadliest typhoon on record to hit the Philippines, killing more than 6,300 people. Haiyan was the strongest storm ever recorded when it made landfall, and according to the United Nations, more than 11 million people have been affected by the storm, with many left homeless. The storm also impacted Palau, southern China, and Vietnam, and other parts of Southeast Asia. Joining me in the studio today is Dr. Jon Matsuoka, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Consuelo Foundation. For those of our viewers that are not familiar with the Consuelo Foundation, it was founded in 1988 by Consuelo Zobo Algier with the mission of improving the quality of life for disadvantaged children and women and families in the Philippines and in Hawaii. Since beginning activities in the Philippines in 1993, the foundation has invested more than $75 million in its programs and has reached more than 400,000 women and children. Currently, the foundation operates support programs in Hawaii and the Philippines that prevent and treat abuse, neglect, and the exploitation of children, women, and families. Dr. Matsuoka has been the president and CEO of the Consuelo Foundation for the past 3 years. Prior to joining the foundation, he was a professor at the Myron B. Thompson School of Social Work at the University of Hawaii, where he served as dean during the last 10 years of his tenure. His academic work focused on social impacts, the effects of socio-ecological change on human behavior, and global issues in social work. Dr. Matsuoka, a warm welcome from myself and from ThinkTech Hawaii. It's a pleasure to have you on the program. Today we're talking about recovery efforts in the wake of Super Typhoon Haiyan. In February of last year, the Consuelo Foundation initiated Project HOPE, which stands for Haiyan Operations for Protection and Empowerment. The program has had a positive impact in the Visayan region, and you yourself have had your own boots on the ground in the Philippines. So first of all, to start off, can we talk a little bit about the background here? Super Typhoon Haiyan, known as Yolanda in the Philippines, it struck the islands in November of 2013, and it's the deadliest typhoon on record in the modern era, anyway, to hit the Philippines, killing more than 6,300 people. Could you tell us a little bit about the preparations that were made in the weeks leading up to the storm's landfall, and what about the immediate impact of the storm?
Yes. Thanks, Keith, for having me.
Yeah,
Thanks for inviting me to be a part of this. Well, modern technology is such where we have satellite imagery, and so everybody in the Philippines understood that there was a super typhoon that was heading their way, which gave them ample warning to evacuate, which many did. Millions of people moved out of harm's way into safer, higher ground. At the same time, there was a lot of confusion about this concept of storm surge. So while many people evacuated, many people did not, especially those people that were in the Tacloban Leyte area, and they stayed. And for a variety of reasons, one of which was, again, confusion around what storm surge was.
Right.
They thought it was water that was going to be pushed up onto land. They had no idea how much water.
Like a high tide, that's
high
what
tide,
they imagined.
right.
Sure.
And so, we've talked to several people and realized that if they may have described storm surge in the same way that they would describe a tsunami, perhaps people would have left.
Right.
But many did not. At the same time, many people stayed in their homes, especially men, to guard their homes.
Wow.
So women and children evacuated from their homes. They went to shelters, they went to safe places. And men stayed behind because they were concerned about protecting their homes and about, you know, people breaking in and things like that. And in some communities where we're doing our work, there are a whole communities of widows because their husbands died in the storm surge. We soon after, I mean, immediately after the Haiyan struck the Visayas and Samar, we put together a team of experts that basically did reconnaissance. So they went from eastern Samar, from the point at which Haiyan or Yolanda made landfall, all the way to where it left the country in Palawan.
Right.
And they basically did a kind of an assessment of what happened, what was going on, the extent of damage, and who we might partner with on the ground to do a recovery effort. And I happened to travel to the devastated areas about a month after Haiyan, and it was just a sight to be seen. I mean, I couldn't imagine. You really can't get a feel for the place through television.
Right.
When you're on the ground, you get the mood of the people. Obviously, the devastation is visual, but you have the smells. You have the smells of decay, and the whole kind of emotional feel of the place is very different from what you might gather from television.
Right. So what is, in a situation like this, what's the mood of the people when you were there?
It's really interesting because, you know, there's this kind of image of Filipinos as being incredibly resilient, which they are.
Right.
But also happy, and you know, they'll take any blow you hand them, and so they bounce back really fast. When we first went there, there was a mood of widespread trauma and depression, and you could see it in the faces. You can pick it up from the mood of the people and the behaviors. People were sitting around listlessly.
Yeah.
When the typhoon struck, it wiped out everything, including the economy.
Yeah.
And you know, again, the image of Filipinos are that they're industrious, they're hardworking, they're you know, they work to eat, they work to survive, and when we went there was nothing to do.
Wow.
The industries, the economy was devastated.
Just so in the Tacloban area, I understand that fishing is a major industry. What are some of the other important economic activities?
Fishing, farming, Tacloban. There are, you know, a lot of tourist-related activities.
Yeah.
Your standard, you know, kind of small economic systems that go along with fishing and farming,
right,
and tourism, which are the mainstays.
So in a lot of places we see fairly clear distinctions between gender roles in the economy. And you mentioned that in the aftermath of Haiyan, or Haiyan disproportionately affected the victims of Haiyan, the casualties were disproportionately males. In terms of the structure of the economy and the functioning of the household economy in Tacloban and the surrounding areas, what does that do to overall household livelihood?
Well, you know, I don't know what the ratio is in terms of people, in terms of fatalities,
right,
but in certain communities they were much more slanted towards males. What we've done is in those communities where fathers, husbands died, we've invested in the development of microeconomies for women. And so in the past, where women in these particular communities may have been primarily mothers and you know, taking care of the household, now they're forced into a situation where they have to generate revenue in order to support their children. And so we've invested in a variety of different kind of micro enterprises for women.
So when you talk about micro enterprises, there's a whole range of initiatives. In some cases, there's micro insurance. I guess that the grandfather of all of all micro programs was microcredit. So could you be a little bit more specific about the types of initiatives that you have?
We have invested in basic kind of commercial activities, including what's called Saudi stores. And
so
we're
providing loans to people to start up their own store?
Not necessarily loans, but grants, basically. We're providing support for women to basically find a space to...
So these aren't revolving loans? Or
No.
Okay. So it's not like a Grameen Bank type
of
thing?
No, not at all. But those are... those systems are systems that we have considered and we have implemented in other parts of the Philippines, not related to Haiyan.
Right.
So they're worthy systems, they're viable systems in other places. In this case, we provided monetary support and training. Of course, training is a big part of that because these are women that are thrusted into being the primary wage earner. And so they have to know how to run a business. They have to know all of the mechanics of doing that, and then also space and merchandise.
It seems like it would be a fairly steep learning curve for a lot of people. And there's not you don't have very much of a window to operate because you're dealing with a situation where people need money to live right now.
Yeah.
So that's got to be a particularly difficult challenge to overcome.
There obviously are challenges, but at the same time, we don't just kind of dab out money and resources. We provide the supports they need in order to enhance the probability of success.
Right.
And so we provide technical assistance and we create systems of social support within those communities.
Okay, so rebuilding the social capital.
Right.
And the relationships, the informal structures of support that people draw on in disaster situations. I see.
And what's interesting is that in a place like the Philippines, where there's a lot of collectivity, right? So you would imagine that people creating or building stores and businesses would be in direct competition, which in some ways they are, but we try to kind of allay that competition through creating a social system that really was more about mutual support than it was about competition.
I see. So is the hope that will, is that just a ephemeral thing, or is the hope that will kind of become the basis of the new economy going forward as Tacloban and the surrounding areas rebuilt?
That's just really one example. We really try to make our investments place specific.
I see.
So what are people predisposed to do? What do they know about? What do they do well? And in many cases, like you mentioned before, we built fishing boats in fisher communities. And it gave us an opportunity to do things better and infuse values that perhaps weren't there prior to the devastation. For example, if there were people, if there were a fisher community in an island where they weren't practicing sustainable fishing practices, we would encourage sustainable fishing practices.
Right.
And we would bring in people with the know-how in terms of, catch levels and how much you can take from the ocean, and while through reproductive means that it's being replenished. Then we would bring that knowledge and infuse that know-how into the practices. Just overall, I might be jumping ahead, but overall, typhoons are terrible tragedies, but we also see them as great opportunities to rebuild in ways that bring forth more green activities, green principles, rebuild in ways that are stronger, that encourage more social capital and cohesion, and basically greater resilience and greater equity among the people.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Matsuoka. We're going to take a break just for a moment here. We'll be back at ThinkTech Asia in just a moment. Thank you.
Aloha, Yappers. This is your host, Kingsley, for the Yap Show. Every Friday, 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern Time. You can catch us here live, ThinkTech Hawaii, and then later on we upload to our YouTube channel. We talk about youth issues, policies, youth programs, and how to transition yourself into adulthood.
But this was like a sign, I guess, hey, life's like, hey,
Right.
now's your chance to go back to school, which I'm doing.
Catch us here again live, 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. Hawaii Standard Time. Aloha.
Camera okay?
Okay,
Okay.
welcome back to ThinkTech Asia. I'm your host, Keith Bettinger, and today we're talking about the Super Typhoon Haiyan, known in the Philippines as Yolanda. Joining me today in the studio is Dr. Jon Matsuoka from the Consuelo Foundation. We've been talking a little bit about the Consuelo Foundation's efforts to push recovery forward and to rebuild better. And it's really disasters are difficult situations or tragic situations, and so it's sometimes difficult to think about building back better or finding the bright side. But your programs, from what you've told us, your programs are working to build social capital and to create a foundation for a stronger and more resilient society. Now, there's one thing that we mentioned earlier that I'd like to go back to about the storm surge, because it sticks in my mind that this misunderstanding of the concept of storm surge was that was a breakdown in communication. So when we talk about storm surge, a storm surge is generated by tropical storms, hurricanes, typhoons, and it's a function of the speed of the winds pushing water out in front of the storm, and also the low pressure of the storm system. And so there's a higher sea level, and in some cases, in the case of Tacloban, I think it was 20 to 30 feet in some cases, up to 10 meters.
Right.
And so this is one of the things that caused a lot of damage in Katrina. It's just a wall of water, and it's incessant, and it just keeps coming and coming and coming. And people were unprepared for this. I believe you mentioned that if they complained that if they had been told about this as if it were a tsunami, they would have been better prepared. Now, my question, and I don't know if you'll be able to answer this. I hope you can. Is Philippines has always dealt with typhoons, always. What was different about this particular storm surge?
Well, the main difference was the magnitude of the storm, right? The strongest typhoon to ever make landfall in the history of recording these types of natural disasters. And so that was a major difference. I mean, up to 200-mile-an-hour winds, and all these other features that,
so
that
this
made
was
it
just
unique.
above and beyond anything that they'd ever experienced
Right.
before. I see.
Philippines gets hit every year with multiple typhoons, but nothing like Haiyan Yolanda that struck Samar and Leyte, and the Visayas went right through the Visayas like a huge bowling ball and left this swath of devastation.
Right. Wow. So I understand that the climatological and meteorological analyses of this point to increased sea surface temperatures as one of from global warming, attributable to global warming, as one of the main drivers for this, the incredible intensity of Haiyan. My next question is about global warming, climate change, because the Philippines, along with much of Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Indonesia, they're all very vulnerable, among the most vulnerable places in the world to climate change.
Right.
Now, has the impact of and the experience of Haiyan, has that increased the awareness amongst government, NGOs, and other stakeholders in the Philippines about the threats, about the potential dangers of global warming? And if it has it led to action?
Yes. You know, because of the history of typhoons passing through the Philippines, that awareness is already there.
I see.
But again, nothing like Haiyan has ever struck the Philippines before. And just last month, there was another typhoon that was brewing in the Pacific with this trajectory to go through the Philippines. It did. By the time it hit the Philippines, it had subsided substantially. There's still a lot of damage, but you saw the response that people had to this typhoon because a year prior, because of Haiyan.
Right.
And so there was massive evacuations. People took it seriously.
Sure.
And communications and definitions and information about things like storm surge have become much more clear in the minds of officials and, of course, residents.
So it's been institutionalized or mainstreamed.
Yes.
I see.
Yes,
I
much
see.
more so. Nobody is ever going to have confusion about storm surge in the future.
Right.
When that term is used with an oncoming typhoon.
I see.
There's a very substantial green movement in the Philippines. So people are very aware of climate change and global warming and the implications of that. So, you know, it's not like people are naive to cause and effect related to the you know, how climate change and what that means in terms of more frequent and more powerful typhoons.
I see.
What I think what happened was that you know, in some communities they were very well organized. Where we built 100 fishing boats on a small island, the whole fishing fleet was wiped out, but there were no fatalities. The community was very well organized. They had a very strong mayor. As soon as they got the warning, they all headed to the highlands, and they stayed in caves during the duration of the storm. Other communities were much less organized. So I think what Haiyan has done is it created you know, a much more conscientious populace around what to do in the face of a typhoon approaching.
I see. So in your, you just mentioned about the fishing boats and the village that escaped to caves. And so it seems like we can identify in that instance a key variable is the leadership.
Right.
And along with in climate change adaptation, for example, leadership has been identified as one of the key variables for the success of adaptation and resilience building. Are there any other lessons from the Haiyan experience that distinguish communities that suffered greatly, that were impacted and still suffer, than those that have exhibited greater resilience? So there, besides the leadership, and you mentioned organization as well, what goes into, because you're never going to stop a storm surge, what goes into building resilience in this situation?
Well, in terms of the first part of your question, I think communities that got a lot of media coverage actually fared better because
really?
A lot of aid went to those communities.
I see.
And because of that, we deliberately identified communities that were not as covered through the mass media, that were equally devastated, that were off the beaten track and not heard about much through television and CNN and places like that. So a lot of aid flowed to those areas, like Tacloban, for example. There's a lot of aid, foreign aid, in particular, that flowed to Tacloban. But the whole area was devastated. The whole, you know, from eastern Samar and that whole area around Leyte was devastated. Of devastation. And there were so many communities that received very little aid. So we sought out those communities because we knew they weren't receiving a whole lot of support, and we developed relationships. So there's a lot of lessons learned in terms. You know, it begins with developing relationships with proactive, strong government leaders, of which there are a lot in the Philippines. And there's this image of the Philippines where there's not a lot of good, strong political leadership, but there is, especially at the local level. And we sought out those leaders that we felt we could work with and that we could trust. And at the same time, we developed relationships with local NGOs, non-government organizations, again, that we felt we could work with and trust. And that's what it's all about. You have to be able to develop relationships with people on the ground that really know the cultural and the social and geographic landscape to be able to succeed.
So for you as a donor, as a sponsoring foundation, it seems like some key lessons there, maybe that you already knew, but key lessons for the rest of us are understanding what's going on the ground, a political and institutional setup on the ground, and being able to tailor your intervention or your assistance to the local considerations, to give it a local flavor, so to speak. I don't want to run out of time before we get to all the important questions. I know you're really eager to tell us about what's left to be done. So you yourself are going back to the Philippines next week, and you'll be visiting the Visayan, Tacloban, if I'm not mistaken. And you've been there several times, and recovery in the disaster cycle. Recovery is the longest stage of the disaster cycle, and in a situation like this, the devastation can last for years and years. What in your mind and in your perception is the most immediate needs in the Philippines, in the Tacloban region?
The immediate needs have been met, basically. The immediate needs were really about food and shelter. And you know, the economy to a certain level has been restored. I mean, people aren't starving. The immediate needs were supplies and food and tents and tarps and things to keep you out of the elements. And clean water.
Right.
So a lot of the folks that specialize in those things, like emergency relief agencies, including Red Cross,
right,
where they're on the scene providing those services. Now, the question that you're alluding to is what happens after those immediate needs are met.
Right.
And for us, because we do most of our work in the Philippines, we're in there for the long run. We have been. We're not gonna just address the first 6 months of recovery. We're there as long as we can be, and so we have a vested interest in rebuilding those areas.
I see.
And again, we want to build better and stronger and greener and all those things. And so the second phase of our recovery process will involve building communities from the ground up.
So when we come back, we have got to take a break just for a moment. When we come back, we'll talk about bridging, making the bridge from recovery to development. This is ThinkTech Asia. Thank you very much for joining us.
Aloha, I'm Hunter Hevlin, host of Sustainable Hawaii here at ThinkTech Hawaii. You can tune in every week on Thursday at 2 p.m. to see interviews with sustainability professionals from around the state and even further abroad, learning about activities with water management, food security, waste management, and a whole host of other fascinating opportunities to get engaged with making a greener island. So if you're interested in making the transition from consuming individuals to communities of producers, check us out every Thursday. Aloha. Sure.
Okay, welcome back to ThinkTech Asia. My name is Keith Bettinger. I'm your host. Thank you for joining us. Again, my guest today is Dr. Jon Matsuoka, President and CEO of the Consuelo Foundation. And we're talking today about the recovery in the Philippines from the impact of Super Typhoon Haiyan, locally known as Yolanda. And when we went into the break, we were starting to touch on moving from recovery to development. And you mentioned that the Consuelo Foundation is in it for the long haul, for the long run, and there's an interest in the foundation building stronger communities. So could you tell us very briefly about some aspects going forward of improving on development indicators and so forth?
Sure. We were able to, we decided to commit a certain amount of resources, money, to the recovery effort. We kind of put that up as match, and we were able to then raise a substantial amount of money through the generosity of local people and banks and such. But even then, the amount that we raised is compared to the amount needed for recovery and rebuilding was just a drop in the bucket.
Sure.
So we had to be very strategic in terms of how we applied that money. As we enter into the second phase of recovery, we're very interested now in building a community, and we've selected a site. We've spoken with planners and architects. Where there are certain challenges that we face in terms of acquiring the land, but we feel like we can work through those challenges. And we're basically wanting to build a community for people that lost their homes during the typhoon. And
so you're building a whole settlement, essentially.
Settlement.
Wow.
Right.
Yeah.
And which would basically be, and what we have to do is cost is a real critical factor. Sure. Because we don't want to put all of our money into an expensive community. So we want to build wisely. We want to incorporate all of these really contemporary principles into the design of this community. At the same time, we want to make it affordable. And we're doing that because we hope that government at some point or other foundations would come in and say, we like what's happened here, we want to replicate it.
Right.
So we're looking at particular designs, layouts of homes, architectural designs, sustainable utilities, including micro-utilities that are very interesting.
So wind turbines, micro hydro, things like that.
Right, yeah. Solar using, we think about what's needed in the face of in the aftermath of a typhoon.
Right.
Clean water, telecommunications, those are critical critical elements that were lost after Haiyan. And there's actually a person locally that has developed this technology that we've taken to the Philippines that we want.
Locally in Hawaii?
In Hawaii.
Wow.
Yeah, so he's done some incredible work. And you know, the amazing thing about our effort is that people came from out of the woodwork to say, I've got something to offer.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, this person did. You know, it's not enough to build homes and to build utilities. We're looking at building communities. And what does that mean?
Sure.
That means what kind of features need to be in place to encourage a cohesive community where there's sharing of activities, there's a strong bond, there's social capital that's created, leadership is locally derived, and so on.
I see.
And again, all of the, you know, the technologies that we know about that are affordable,
Mm-hmm.
including you know, waste management, that we want to incorporate into this community.
Right.
So we're
a model community.
a model
essentially.
community that is built affordably, and
Mhm.
again, it can be replicated. And what's key, and we touched on this issue earlier, the folks that were most at risk, the folks that were most affected by the typhoon, were poor people, informal settlers that were living in low-lying coastal areas. And
So had they, like migrants, people that had moved to,
Right.
from, oh, okay.
or people from that province that were landless, that
Mhm.
basically, you know, settled informally on land that they had no title to.
Sure. So
And
there are
that's-
deeper issues that are driving this
There are
vulnerability.
deeply rooted issues
Yeah.
that we feel, to a certain extent, we can address
Right.
through building these communities.
I see. All right. Well, my last question today, before we move into our Culture Corner segment, is I understand the Consuelo Foundation has produced a film, a documentary about the devastation of Haiyan. I've actually seen some clips of it. It's really remarkable, the footage and the perspectives that are in the documentary. Would you tell us a little bit about this film that your organization has produced?
Sure. You know, Consuelo Foundation has been kind of a, you know, we tried for many years, tried to stay below the radar. And this particular activity around Haiyan recovery, we kind of had this coming out kind of event, and because we basically asked the public to support our recovery efforts in the Philippines. And so the documentary was really an exercise in accountability.
Right.
And we worked with Emmy Tamimbong, who we took to the Philippines. She did a wonderful job basically portraying our efforts in the Philippines. And it was basically, you know, accountability is always an important issue when you're drawing resources from people
Sure.
that some of whom have a lot of resources and give a lot, some of whom have very little resources.
And you
they
raised
still get
millions of dollars locally
Yes,
in Hawaii.
yes.
Yeah.
And so we wanted to basically share with the Hawaii public what we've done in the Philippines, where their monies went,
I see.
and how they were being applied.
So if our viewers are interested in seeing the film, how can they do that?
Well, they could, I don't
I guess
know.
that's up to
We
you,
have to
huh?
look at that. We're looking at perhaps putting it
Oh, I see.
on-
So in the future, it will be available. It just came out.
Right, it just came out.
Well, so maybe would be on television locally, or?
It's aired 3 times on television.
Oh, it
locally,
has.
yes.
So you just have to look up
Right,
the listings.
yeah.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much, Dr. Matsuoka. I really appreciate your presence here. We learned a lot, not just about the storm, but about the recovery and what it takes to build a stronger community that's more resilient to storms in the future. Because one of the this hazard has always been ever present in the Philippines. But given climate change and global warming, all the projections suggest that storms will be increasingly frequent and increasingly intense into the future. And so this Haiyan, it seems to be a 1 in 100 year event at this point. But there are real worries that this is going to be the new normal going into the future. And so efforts by organizations like the Consuelo Foundation are especially important, not just in recovering, but building up a better society. So today, with our Cultural Corner, we're coming to the end of our program. Thank you again, Dr. Matsuoka. I really appreciate your presence.
Pleasure.
We're coming to the end of our program, and so it's time for this week's Culture Corner, where we showcase a little slice of Asian culture every week. And so this week, since our topic focuses on the Visayan regions of the Philippines, we're going to feature a music and dance performance that originates in Leyte in the Visayan Islands. This clip is from a performance by Banda Kawayan, a community ensemble hosted by the Filipino Community Center in Waipahu. In this performance, which was filmed at the Honolulu Festival in March of last year, Banda Kawayan is performing Tinikling, a pre-Spanish dance that involves two people beating, tapping, and sliding bamboo poles on the ground against each other in coordination, with one or more dancers who step over and in between the poles in a dance. Tinikling is commonly performed at special occasions like the Filipino Independence Day on June 12th. I want to thank my new friends at the Philcom Center for sending this video resource. It's really appropriate that they're a part of today's program because they've partnered with the Consuelo Foundation in the Haiyan relief. They raised $700,000 in the community here in Hawaii, and the Consuelo Foundation matched that dollar for dollar and provided some additional funds as well from foundation monies. So that does it for this week's edition of ThinkTech Asia Week. I'm your host, Keith Benninger, and again, thanks to my guest, Dr. Jon Matsuoka. And I want to extend a thanks to Jay Fidel and the studio crew for making this happen today. And with that, we'll see you next week. Thank you very much.